All right, so I read that any serious study of the book of Revelation begins by understanding Daniel. So tonight we're going to begin our study with the book of Daniel. And then we're going to move to Revelation after we're finished with Daniel. The book of Daniel is going to take us about 12 weeks to complete. So after Christmas and after New Year's and stuff, when we have those couple weeks off, it's going to take us into about March of next year. And then Revelation is going to take about 22 weeks to go through. And so we're going to wrap up this Bible study series somewhere around August or September next year. So, and of course, those dates are subject to change. Void where prohibited. We reserve the right to refuse service to anybody. No shirt, no shoes, no service. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside of the vehicles. Por favor, mantenga sus manos y pies dentro del vehicular el todo momento. I had to Google what they say at Disneyland. All right, so with all that being said, let's get into our new Bible study series, Daniel and Revelation. So I wanted to show you some of the artwork that I put together. Well, I mean, I didn't make the actual artwork, but just for the study, just to have some background slides and stuff. There's this one, which I feel is kind of like a Michael Bay movie or something. Just, I don't know, it seemed kind of intense. Then go to the next one. So that, if you can see, go back to the, oh wait, is that the second one? Well, go to the second one. No. The one after the, yeah, okay. So this is artistic representation of some of the verbiage that's in the book of Revelation. And it's always been fascinating to me to see how people depict this stuff. And obviously, when we get into it, we're going to discover that he's not really talking about the things that you would think of physically like this. But putting it together is super interesting. Go to the next one. So this is this is several different depictions of stuff from Revelation here. Pretty cool. Next one. That's like an old painting of stuff from Revelation. Next one. Another one that's pretty crazy. And then this last one is actually my favorite for some reason. For years, this has been my favorite one. That's supposed to represent famine and stuff. And it's got the scales of judgment there, but with the locusts and like the sickly horse, and like for some reason that's like, it's interesting to me that somebody could come up with that. So, oh, you don't have to do that one yet. Anyway. Huh? No, he's forward. You can see his little head is got a bunch of eyes facing that way. But, okay, so Daniel and Revelation. So let's get started here in the book of Daniel. So before we actually get into the book itself, let's talk about who Daniel was and what, when, where, and how, and all that stuff. So Daniel lived about 600 years before Christ did. So he was alive somewhere between 620 and 538 BC. Some fun facts about that era is, if you go to the next one now, that's when the construction began on the Acropolis, or however you pronounce that, of Athens. So that started construction around the same time. The Mayan civilization was still flourishing. So that's a flourishing Mayan civilization there. So that was still flourishing in Mexico. And then Confucius and Buddha actually lived during that time frame as well. So pretty interesting. Now the book itself is interesting because some people doubt that Daniel actually wrote Daniel, or that Daniel wrote the entire book of Daniel, because they point to the way it was written. A lot of the book is written in the third person. They said, well, it doesn't make sense. If you wrote the book, why would you write it in third person? But that doesn't mean that he didn't really write it. So apparently it was normal for ancient writers to write in the third person, even when they're writing about themselves. It was something that was normal. And actually, some scriptural references of this, even God in the book of Exodus changes between first and third person within a matter of a few verses here. If you look at Exodus 20, verse 2, he says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of slavery. But then in verse 7, just 5 verses later, he says, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain." So he flipped between first and third person, and he's God. So if that wasn't enough to convince you, Jesus flat out says, as recorded in the Gospel of Matthew and in Mark, that Daniel wrote it. So if you look at Matthew 25, verse 15, he says that the abomination of desolation, which was spoken through Daniel the prophet. And then in Mark, it records the same thing, saying that it was recorded by Daniel. So what's interesting is that this book, too, it's so accurately, the things that he predicts are so accurately predicted, and he prophesies about certain things that people flat out think it's impossible. There's no way he could have known that stuff. It's too detailed, it's too accurate. There's no way. A lot of people say, it was probably written later. They believe that this book was actually written up to 800 years later, 200 years after Christ. A lot of people think that somebody wrote it back then and then pretended like they wrote it 800 years earlier and tried to predict this stuff because it was so accurate. And we're going to get into some of that stuff. And some contemporary scholars believe that Daniel was, like I said, some anonymous writer writing in 167 BC rather than 530 BC. So, but none of that is proven, and that's what I'm getting at here. Jesus spoke about him directly, and not to mention that the prophet Ezekiel mentions Daniel directly as well in 3 different places, actually. In Ezekiel 14:14, he says, he specifically mentions Noah, Daniel, and Job. In Ezekiel 14:20, he again mentions Noah, Daniel, and Job. And then Ezekiel 14, verse 3, he says, "Behold, you're wiser than Daniel." He mentions Daniel by name, the prophet Ezekiel. So based on the testimonies of Jesus and Ezekiel, just in terms of the scriptural evidence that we're talking about tonight, it's pretty clear that Daniel wrote the book of Daniel. Daniel was an actual prophet that wrote this book. It was not something that somebody wrote sometime later because it's too accurate. It's God intervening and God speaking through this man. And as we're going to see today, right off the bat, right in the first chapter, there's so much of God stepping in. So that's what happened here. So let's have a little faith while we're reading this book, and let's be excited at the accuracy of it instead of trying to negate it here. So the book of Daniel is typically divided into 2 parts. You got the first 6 chapters, and you're going to read about Daniel and his friends and what happened with them and how they were loyal to God and their faithfulness. And again, it jumps right into it with the first chapter. And then the other 6 chapters, we're going to read about Daniel's dreams and these prophetic messages and how God sent him messages and dreams, and God told Daniel what would happen in the future. And what's so cool about this is we get to see actual historical stuff that's actually been archaeologically proven. We get to see that stuff prophesied 2,600 years ago. That's pretty astounding. So anyway, another way to look at the book of Daniel is interesting and unique because it blends a narrative with prophetic materials and prophetic information, which is kind of not typical. Typically, you have kind of certain ways that books are presented in the Bible, but this one takes a narrative and then it adds prophetic stuff into it, and it has apocalyptic stuff in it too. It's got so much stuff in this book. It's super interesting. I'm actually really excited that we're studying this book. So as we get into the first chapter, just to get ready here, the events in this first chapter, so now we're done with the overview. Now we're going to jump into the first chapter. So the events in the first chapter happened about 605 years before Jesus was born. God had told the Jews to obey him, and then God gave his people a long time to basically admit that they're being disobedient and repent and come back to him, and they failed to do so, which, if you were here for our 12 minor prophets study, the Israelites are pretty good about doing that. From the get-go, God said, dude, all you got to do is do what I say and things are going to be good. If you don't do what I say, judgment's going to come. And constantly, they fall short. And I mean, we're not one to, I mean, I'm not one to talk. We're not ones to talk because we constantly fall short as well. Just thank God nobody's writing a book about me, because I'm sure somebody would read it and be like, man, this guy can't get it together. But anyway, kind of same old story at this point with Israel. So they were doing evil things at the time, and they were actually turning to false gods. So God, what he did, and as we saw several times in the Minor Prophets as well, he used something else to punish them. He used something else as judgment. And in this case, what he uses is a foreign king. He uses a foreign king to punish the Jews. So eventually it's King Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon, not when this actually he starts in the first part of the chapter, but he's going to be a central figure here. God used King Nebuchadnezzar to punish the Jews. And in fact, the book of Jeremiah records God saying that Nebuchadnezzar was God's servant, which is really cool. In Jeremiah 25, God says, "Because you've not obeyed my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, and I will send to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and I will bring them against this land and against the inhabitants and against all the surrounding nations." I love that because it shows that God is able to do that God can use somebody that doesn't even believe in him, doesn't acknowledge that he exists, and doesn't even care that he exists, and yet God can intervene and use somebody like that for his judgment and for his justice. Awesome. We serve a powerful God. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into chapter 1 here. It's 21 verses, I believe. Book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 1, starting with verse 1. It says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it." Now, Jehoiakim, king of Judah, he was a Judean king he was actually placed on the throne by the king of Egypt, or by the Pharaoh of Egypt, I should say. And his name means Yahweh rises up. But it's interesting because Pharaoh was the one that appointed him. And as we've seen before in other prophetic books, this starts out by telling us when this was written. And if you remember when we did the 12 minor prophets, most of them started off that way, where it talks about who was king and what year it was, so that you can actually date it, which is great when you go back and you look at the context and you look at the history of it, because you can actually date it. So the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, during that time, King Nebuchadnezzar, who wasn't quite the ruler of the Babylonian Empire yet, he came to Jerusalem and he besieged it. So the name Nebuchadnezzar is actually a Hebrew transliteration, and I didn't know this. I found this out. It's a Babylonian name that means Nebu protects the crown, but Nebuchadnezzar is not the way it's pronounced. That's a transliteration because they didn't have the correct lettering. And I don't have it written down here, but it's pronounced way different than Nebuchadnezzar. But we say Nebuchadnezzar. So a little bit of history. This verse just says that he came to Jerusalem and he besieged it. But there's a lot bigger picture there, actually. What happened was, at the time, Jerusalem was actually loyal to the Pharaoh of Egypt. So Pharaoh of Egypt invaded Babylon. And when that happened, Nebuchadnezzar was actually still a prince at the time. Nebuchadnezzar was kind of commander-in-chief, and Nabopolassar was the king of Babylon. That's his dad. But because Egypt invaded Babylon, Prince Nebuchadnezzar fought against and defeated the Egyptians at a place called Carchemish, or Carchemish, however you want to pronounce it. But Carchemish was located on the Euphrates River. So that's kind of on this side. I didn't put a map, but it's up here. And the Battle of Carchemish was fought around 605 BC. And so that's how we know kind of when this was written. And it was between the armies of Egypt that were actually allied with remnants of the army of the former Assyrian Empire against the armies of Babylon that were aligned with the Medes and the Scythians. So a lot of just kind of history there, but this verse just says, oh, he came to Jerusalem and he besieged it, but there's actually a backstory as to why he even went to Jerusalem. So the Euphrates is up here, Egypt is over here, and he came down, fought them, and then on his way back up is when he hits Jerusalem, and I'll get to that in a second. But so Nebuchadnezzar became king a few weeks after this battle in 605 BC. So after this battle, the Egyptians fled. So like I said, Carchemish was located on the Euphrates River. So they're fighting up here, and then the Egyptians fled, and then Nebuchadnezzar chased them down to Sinai, and then either along the way there or along the way back, that's when he came against Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was kind of caught in the middle of these guys. So this was the first encounter between Nebuchadnezzar and the Judean king at the time, but it was not the last encounter between them. There would actually be a couple later invasions, 8 years later, and then another 10 years after that. But this first battle, a lot of people thought that this was inaccurate. A lot of people thought, oh, this is wrong. This is not dated correctly. This didn't even really exist because it wasn't actually recorded in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, that battle of Carchemish. But a collection of tablets were actually discovered as early as 1887 that documented that battle specifically. And on top of that, there's archaeological excavations that actually document the victory of Nebuchadnezzar over the Egyptians at Carchemish. And it was actually found to be dated somewhere around May or June in 605 BC. Again, it's so cool to be able to go back and look at this stuff and see how accurate this is. Archaeologists? Yeah. The guys that just dig stuff up. They found evidence of the battle. They found everything from arrowheads to layers of ash. And they actually found a shield of a Greek mercenary that was fighting for the Egyptians. So they actually found actual hard evidence of that battle. So anyway, sometime during his travels, King Nebuchadnezzar, before he was king, he got word that his father died. And so he kind of stopped everything and he went back to Babylon to claim the throne for himself. And because of that, the siege of Jerusalem in 605 BC was actually cut short. But apparently, in a matter of a couple weeks, during that time when he's trying to fight with the Egyptians, and he's trying to fight with the Jews, and he's running all over the place, he wound up traveling somewhere around 500 miles in a span of 2 weeks, which was insane at the time. All of that being said, that's verse 1. So let's see what else Daniel records here. This is when we start to get into the backstory here of Daniel, and all of that's relevant because now you're going to understand who's involved in this and why certain things are being done here. Verse 2. And the Lord handed Jehoiakim, king of Judah, over to him, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, so he is Nebuchadnezzar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. So first of all, it's pretty interesting that God would even allow that to happen. So this guy's taking holy stuff from the Jewish temple, and now he's kind of defacing it and putting it in his own temple with his own false god. And this is actually described in a little bit more detail in 2 Kings in chapter 24. It describes it a little bit more detailed. So I'll read some of the verses about it. It says, he led into exile all the people of Jerusalem and all the commanders and all the valiant warriors, 10,000 exiles, and all the craftsmen and the smith. None were left except the poorest people of the land. So, and that's all done on purpose, because if you're going to conquer somebody, you're going to take all their best stuff. So then he led Jehoiakim into exile to Babylon, also the king's mother, the king's wives, and his officials and the leading men of the land, and he led into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. So now he's taken all the strong people, all the predominant people, and all the valiant men, 7,000, and the craftsman and the smith, 1,000, all strong and fit for war. These two, the king of Babylon, brought into exile to Babylon. So now he's absorbing all of the powerful people of Jerusalem. So not only that, but interesting, this was actually prophesied in Isaiah chapter 39. It says, and some of your sons who will come to you, whom you will father, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. And it's worth noting, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago in our Sunday study, but the word eunuch there is not literally a eunuch. The word in Isaiah that's used there for eunuch, it actually comes from a phrase that means to be a servant to the king. So what that verse is saying is that those people will become servants of the king, which is exactly what happened as documented in 1 Kings and in archaeological history. So because of Israel's idolatry and their failure to obey God, their failure to be obedient, God handed them over, and that's how he exacted judgment on them. Not only were they made servants of the king and they were exiled and all that stuff that was just listed off there, but the city of Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. And that was all recorded in 2 Kings 25, verses 9 to 10. It says, he burned the house of the Lord and the king's house and all the houses of Jerusalem, even the great house he burned with fire. So all the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the bodyguards tore down the walls around Jerusalem. Verse 2 in Daniel says that Nebuchadnezzar took some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them into the house of his God, and he brought vessels into the treasury of his God. To do this, so all of this is painting a picture of how Nebuchadnezzar rolls, basically. And it's not just going in and conquering somebody in terms of destroying the stuff. It's going in and conquering them, and then culturally conquering them as well. So this is all tied into this. So when Nebuchadnezzar took the holy stuff out of the temple and put it into his temple, he's essentially mocking God. He's mocking the Jewish God. And he was basically saying, you know what, your God's not as powerful as my God. Look what I did. So he's displaying his power there. Now, obviously, where we start this book in this study, where we're starting this is the Jewish people are in a pretty tough spot here. Right off the bat, the first 2 verses have a lot of history, a lot of context, a lot of stuff's going on, and it's not looking good for the Jewish people here. But then again, first of all, they were the disobedient ones. They were honoring false gods. So in judgment, God actually used Nebuchadnezzar for this stuff. And again, it's a pretty dark beginning to this book, but it's all relevant to get to where Daniel needs to be. So let's continue here. Verses 3 and 4. Then the king told Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom there were no impairment, who were good-looking, suitable for instruction in every kind of expertise, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability to serve in the king's court. And he ordered Ashpenaz to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. Again, he's taking them over, not just in terms of destroying their stuff and taking them, but he's changing the way that they believe. He's changing their culture. He's changing their way of life. And notice who he took there. He's taking the strongest, best people he can get. Youths in whom there was no impairment, royal family, nobles, suitable for instruction in every kind of expertise, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge. It's all very deliberate. King Nebuchadnezzar was a very wise king, pretty ruthless. So not only did King Nebuchadnezzar exile the Jews and took all the holy stuff from the temple, but now he's ordering that young men of Israel are being brought to him. Specifically, the young men there that he's talking about, no impairment, they're young men between the ages of 13 and 17. And that's an important age for any young man. Their development is in that age. So you can imagine if somebody takes a 13 to 17-year-old kid and starts indoctrinating them, they've got them. And then he's got their kids and their kids' kids. So doing this, basically, he's instilling fear there, but he's holding power over them, and he's kind of making sure that these people don't rise up against him either, because he's going after the predominant people, the powerful people, the strong people, the best people. He's going to indoctrinate them to follow him. Who's going to rise up against him? Again, he was very calculated. He made sure people would not rise against him. And then we'll continue here. Verse 5. The king also allotted for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and ordered that they be educated for 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. You can maybe exchange the word educated there with indoctrinated, maybe. But notice, too, he's sharing his best food with them, his best drinks with them. So we get to see more of what King Nebuchadnezzar made these men do. They would be educated for 3 years. And during that time, basically the internal government of Babylon is going to be taking care of them, both from an educational standpoint, but also taking care of their provisions, their food and stuff. And what's interesting is that they would give the food and drink that were the king's choice. That was the best stuff. And that's going to be relevant here in a minute. But in other words, they were kind of given special treatment, these guys. The king's choice of food was way better quality than regular food that other people got. And at first you might wonder, why is the king being nice to these guys? Seems like he's treating them pretty good. He's being nice to the guys that he stole from this other country. Well, it's not really kindness at all. Again, it's very calculated. It's more of an indoctrination than any sort of kindness. And he's pulling these young men away from the Jewish God, is what he's doing. He's pulling them away from Jewish culture. And like I said, 13 to 17 are very formative years for young men. So what he's doing is making sure that they're leaving everything Jewish behind. Everything. And it shows a little bit of insight into Nebuchadnezzar's character and how he operates. He was a very wise person, and he made sure to gather to him the best people among the Jews, the best people that they had to offer. And then he indoctrinated them into Babylonian culture and into his own personal kind of crew here. And as we're going to see, Daniel and a couple of his friends are the ones that are going to stand up against this and decide they're not going to follow suit. And it's really cool. And this is where we really get to see God intervening in a positive way here. So they chose to remain faithful to the Jewish God. And you'll see the benefits of that. Look at verses 6 and 7. It says, "Now among them, from the sons of Judah, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. He gave them Babylonian names. So to Daniel, he assigned the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego." So Daniel and these other guys were given these new Babylonian names. And again, this is more of them trying to distance them from the Jewish God. It's very deliberate. So the name Daniel means God is my judge. Very Jewish name. Jewish names tended to have God, something about God where there. God is my judge. But he changed it to Belteshazzar, which means Bel's prince. Nothing to do with God. Then the Jewish name Hananiah means beloved by the Lord. Another beautiful name. But his name was changed to Shadrach, which means illuminated by the sun god. Now he's putting a pagan god in there. The Jewish name Mishael means who is as God. Another beautiful Jewish name. But it's changed to Meshach, which is kind of up in the air exactly as to what that means. But what I found it's probably what it was changed to mean was who is like Shak. And some believe Shak was this Babylonian goddess kind of similar to Venus, which again follows suit given the other names here. So another pagan god. And then the name Azariah, which means the Lord is my help, was changed to Abednego, which means servant of Nego. More of this kind of indoctrination here. You see them pushing away the Jewish names and assimilating under the Babylonian stuff. Nebuchadnezzar too. I don't know what I wrote there. Nebuchadnezzar II, Jewish names that gave honor to the real God and changed them to Babylonian names. Anyway, so if you notice, like I said, these new names, they reference names of Babylonian false gods and these pagan gods here. And again, they're attempting to get these guys to forget the real God. You can imagine if your name has God in it, you're going to be thinking about God a lot every time you hear your name. But if you change your name to some false god, you're not thinking about your God anymore. Very clever stuff that they're doing here. So let's see Daniel's reaction to this. Verse 8 said, "Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice of food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself." Super interesting here and pretty brave of Daniel. So in this verse, in the New American Standard, it says he made up his mind. Closer to the Hebrew, probably your translation says that Daniel resolved in his heart. He was convicted. He felt conviction there. Daniel decided he's going to remain faithful. He's going to follow his God. And the word there for defile is something that in Judaism, it makes a lot of sense. It means to soil. It means to desecrate. It means to pollute or to stain. Oftentimes they talked about being unclean. So Daniel's speaking from a spiritual perspective here. But it seems like he's working something out with the commander of the officials here. Daniel wanted to remain faithful to the kind of dietary laws of his Jewish faith. He wanted to remain kosher. And I like it because it shows that he took a stand and he made a big deal out of something that arguably is not a big deal, something small. But this is where faithfulness really shows itself. And I love that that's the first act that we see Daniel doing here in this book, is him displaying his faith on something arguably small. But it's showing how big his faith really is, because if we make small compromise after small compromise, our entire faith becomes compromised. So if we remain faithful on the small things, we can avoid that slippery slope. One commentary I read said that Daniel realized that his relationship with God touched every area of his life, including what he ate. Specifically, the root of sin goes back to eating forbidden food. Pretty interesting. But I love that. Daniel realized his relationship with God touched every area of his life, including what he ate. So he took his stand on that small thing. So even though it doesn't specifically speak about the kinds of food that's being offered there, it doesn't actually specifically say this is the stuff that he was being fed, we can assume it probably wasn't kosher. And on top of that, maybe it was actually sacrificed to Babylonian gods or Babylonian idols, which would make it unclean in Judean law. So, not to mention the whole goal of the king here is to integrate these guys into Babylonian culture. So it's worth noting that in that verse, Daniel doesn't mention the other areas of indoctrination there. Daniel didn't really care about the Babylonian name that he was given because it didn't change who he was. Daniel didn't really care about the Babylonian education that he had to go through because he stood firm in what he already knew and what he already believed. He didn't really care about that. But where he took his stance and where Daniel drew the line is with food. And the reason why is because that would actually lead to disobedience to God and God's word. Changing his name was not disobedient to God. Learning somebody else's culture is not disobedient to God. But to go against what God said to eat would go against God. I don't know how old he is here. This is so the battle was in 605. So in the next couple of verses, it jumps a little bit because the siege was in 605, but then it jumps to when the education was done. So then it's 6 years later, or 3 years later. So it's 608. So I'm not entirely sure exactly how old he is. I might be able to find that out, but yeah. I mean, you can imagine probably somewhere in that age because it was talking about being between 13 and 17. So he's probably in that age range. And he winds up serving for like 70 years here too. So that would make sense. So I like that Daniel shows stubborn faith here with the food. I love stubborn faith. Everything that he's known and he's lived has been completely uprooted. His entire life is destroyed, but he's not going to compromise on his faith. You can take my home, you can take my family, you can take my friends, you can take my culture, you can take my name. You're not going to take my God. I love that. And it's brave. Keep in mind who Nebuchadnezzar is and what Nebuchadnezzar can do. If he can march into a city and take everybody, every noble person, and then indoctrinate them, that's a powerful dude. For him to refuse the king's choice of food, that's dangerous. That paints him as a rebel. Or maybe he might be against the king himself. That kind of stuff people would get killed for. He could have gotten himself into a lot of trouble. He could have got himself killed. And again, think about how calculated Nebuchadnezzar was, how calculated ancient rulers were at the time in general. Nebuchadnezzar was very cunning, and he was calculated enough to, like I said, uproot an entire culture and indoctrinate them, specifically the young men and the powerful people and the nobles. Imagine how calculated he could be in coming up with a punishment if somebody did something set against him. Somebody stood up against him. I don't like what you're doing. Ooh, I'm going to go through my Rolodex of torture. Ancient pagan rulers were very notably cruel, and they were capable of extreme violence. Crazy stuff. So, and Nebuchadnezzar was actually no different. In fact, there's some scriptures that share some of the things that he would do. For instance, he murdered the sons of a king of Judah. And what he did is right after he murdered his sons, he gouged out the king's eyes. And he did it so that the king's last memory, his last sight, would be the murder of his children. That's brutal stuff. And that's in Scripture. Jeremiah 39:6 says, the king of Babylon slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes at Riblah. The king of Babylon also slaughtered all the nobles of Judah. He then blinded Zedekiah's eyes and bound him in shackles of bronze to bring him to Babylon. Other rulers of Judah were literally cooked over a fire rotisserie style. Jeremiah again, 29, it says, because of them a curse will be used by all the exiles from Judah who are in Babylon, saying, may the Lord make you like Zedekiah and Ahab, whom the king of Babylon roasted in the fire. So again, Daniel's being pretty brave here, saying, you know what? don't want to eat that food. He's being brave and standing up for his faith. And look what happened. This is when we start to see God intervening, and we get to see how cool this book is going to be. Verse 9, God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. He touched that guy's heart. Faith is rewarded, whether it's in this life or it's in eternity. And actually, according to this verse here, God moved the authority's heart. That guy, and that was a pretty powerful guy too. And God softened his heart. And it shows that he actually had favor and compassion for Daniel. That's crazy. Verses 10 to 12, it says, the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I'm afraid of the Lord my king, who has allotted you your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking gaunt in comparison to the youths who are of your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. Daniel's response, Daniel said to the overseer whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, he said, please put your servants to the test for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. So first of all, the commander of the officials is scared of Nebuchadnezzar. And he said, dude, if you don't eat the food that I gave you, that's the king's food, he's going to kill me. He said, you're going to make me forfeit my head. He's going to cut my head off if you don't eat this food. But Daniel said, you know what? Give us 10 days. Feed us some vegetables, some grains and whatever. Give us some water. I don't want the wine. I don't want this other stuff. Just give us some veggies and some grains and some water. Put us to the test. Because he was concerned that they're going to look malnourished. They're going to be skinny. They're going to stand out. Something's going to get him in trouble. So again, we see that interaction between Daniel and the commander of the officials, and Daniel refusing the king's food. But Daniel's approach to this situation was really reasonable here. He made a polite request to the right person, and he said, put us to the test. Give us 10 days. And I like because it shows how a faithful person should approach situations like this. If you think back during COVID, when California said we weren't allowed to meet in person, we could not have indoor, not even outdoor church, we were not allowed to meet in person, a lot of Christians were really upset about that. A lot of Christians wanted to fight back, and they wanted to outright rebel against it. I remember up on Euclid, there was like a little, not a riot, but like a little thing going on up there. And they're like, you know what, who cares what they say? But then there was people that would point to the Romans in chapter 13, where it says every person is subject to the governing authorities. There's no authority except from God. We got to do what they tell us. But then they would say, yeah, but well, Hebrews says, well, don't abandon each other. Don't forsake the gathering. And then they wanted to like hold this uprising, and they're like, it doesn't matter what they say because they're not godly, blah, 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 blah. And they would fight. Daniel is displaying a completely different reaction to a situation that was beyond his control, and he displays godly wisdom here. James chapter 3 says, the wisdom from above is first pure, then peace-loving, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial, free from hypocrisy. And it seems that Daniel lived this out here in this situation. He made a godly and wise compromise with the commander of the officials. And he said, look, just put us to the test for 10 days. Give us a minute. Try it out. Give us some veggies and some grain and some water, and we should be good. Let's see how it goes. And he continues. Look at verse 13 and 14. It says, then let our appearance be examined in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice of food. Compare the two, and then deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter, and he put them to the test for 10 days. He said, just check it out. Give us 10 days, and then at the end, compare us if we look all malnourished and skinny from eating gross vegetables. I don't like vegetables. He said, then deal with it. You know, if it's obvious that we made a mistake, then you can punish us. You can do whatever you need to do. You can see God being a huge part of Daniel's life. And it's cool, too, because you see God influencing people around Daniel. God influencing people that aren't even Jewish and don't even acknowledge God's existence at all. People don't believe in the Jewish God are being influenced and being emotionally affected. The commander of the officials could have decided to make examples out of these guys. And realistically, he probably should have. He could have turned this into a completely different situation. He said, you know what, if you guys don't like this food that's given, you're going to get treated like these guys. Could have cut off their heads right there, whatever crazy thing they did. But God intervened, and he really changed everything about the situation. He changed it. And it gets even crazier. Check this out. Verse 15 says, at the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating all the king's choice food. Once again, you see God is involved in all of this. These guys were eating veggies and grains and stuff and drinking just water. There's no logical reason that this kind of vegetarian diet would have made their appearance seem better and make them fatter than everybody else that's eating kingly food. There's no logical reason for that. God intervened. Awesome. Verse 16. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and he kept giving them vegetables. So he said, fine, I guess. If it works, if we can keep hiding this, then I'm okay with it. So things went pretty well, and the arrangement kept going, which, again, is really cool. And it probably brought some camaraderie between them, too, which that's what I imagine happened. It seemed like Daniel was just a good guy. I mean, we don't know a whole lot about him quite yet, but it seems like he was a good guy. He was a reasonable guy just in the first several verses of this book. He's a faithful guy. He's wise. He's respectful. Seems like a good guy to me. And it seems like the commander of the officials might have liked him a little bit if he was willing to kind of bend the rules for the guy. But in reality, I would point to his faith. His faith in God is what made Daniel like that. That was his character. That's who he was. But you can see the commander was afraid of Nebuchadnezzar. He was afraid of the king and his power. He was hesitant to work with Daniel in the first place at all. The king might kill him for not feeding them that food. And so again, Daniel said to test it out first, and it seemed like God, through God's intervention, everything worked out okay. Verse 17. And as for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence and every kind of literature and expertise. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. So now you're seeing these spiritual gifts that God was giving these guys, even more godly intervention here. And it's really interesting how God continues to step in Daniel's life here. God gave them knowledge and intelligence and every kind of literature and expertise. And we know it wasn't the Babylonian education that was doing that. It had to have been God. And it obviously was not the food they were eating, because they were eating vegetables and grains. I wouldn't have been able to do it. It had to have been God. It had to have been God stepping into this. It wasn't easy to obey the Jewish God when they were in Babylon. But God helped these young men to obey him. God was there, and he was intervening, and he made them wise, and he even gave Daniel a special gift so that he could understand all kinds of visions and dreams. Faith is being rewarded in real time here. In verses 18 to 20, it says, then at the end of the days which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king talked with them, and out of all, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they enter the king's personal service. As for every matter of expertise and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the soothsayer priests and conjurers who were in his realm. Yeah. Well, duh. It was pretty remarkable. At the end of these 3 years, the commander of the officials presented young men to Nebuchadnezzar. That's what he did. They would educate them and train them up or whatever for 3 years. Then at the end, it seemed like King Nebuchadnezzar would interview each one of these guys. And the king talked with them. But like it says, out of all of them that were taken from Jerusalem, not one of them was found like Daniel and his 3 friends. Because God, again, he intervened. He equipped them. It says that he gave them knowledge and intelligence in every kind of literature and expertise. Of course they're going to stand out, and of course they're going to be valuable, and of course they're going to become, where to go? They're going to enter the king's personal service. It just makes sense. Being faithful and essentially making the best of the circumstances that they found themselves in They stood out from all the other young Jewish men. All the young men that were indoctrinated by the Babylonian culture and the Babylonian literature and the Babylonian religious stuff too. It seems that these 4 specific men, in remaining faithful to God, they stood out. God calls us to be in the world but not be of the world. Well, these 4 guys are an example of young men that are in Babylon but are not of Babylon. They were not indoctrinated. And not only that, verse 20 says, as for every matter of expertise and understanding in which the king consulted them, he found in them 10 times better than all the soothsayer priests and conjurers that were in his realm. What God did here is God took these 4 guys. Not only did he reward their faithfulness, as we just read about, but he rewarded them by making them pretty important people in this foreign country. They were 10 times better than all the soothsayer priests and conjurers who were in his realm. Kings would consult these people. They would go to them for answers. These 4 guys that have the Jewish God at their back are now being able to advise the king, which kind of sets the groundwork for the whole rest of this book. This is just the beginning. We close with verse 21 today. It says, and Daniel continued until the 1st year of Cyrus the king. So just in these first 21 verses here, we can see that God equipped this young man and his friends during this very difficult time in their lives and a very difficult time in the lives of all of Israel. And this first chapter ends on a pretty interesting verse here too, because it spends 20 verses roughly talking about how Daniel got started basically and how he got kind of integrated into the Babylonian government. But then this last verse says that he kept on doing that for 70 years. Like kind of an interesting close. It was like Nebuchadnezzar started going to these guys because they were 10 times better than everybody else. And then they did that for 70 years. Like, it's kind of an interesting way to end it. And we know that because almost 70 years after all this takes place, the Medes and the Persians joined up to defeat the Babylonians. And King Cyrus here that's mentioned, Cyrus the king, he was the king of Persia. So that's how we were able to date about 70 years. So Daniel stayed in Babylon for decades, serving the Babylonian kings and also some kings of Persia at the time. We're going to get through all that stuff. But all the while, what's most important is he remained faithful to serving God first and foremost. And that's Daniel chapter 1. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for Daniel and using him, God, and equipping him and doing amazing things through him, God. Just reading that first chapter is so exciting, and knowing that you intervene in such calculated and awesome ways, God. You are so huge. So it's exciting to read your word. It's exciting to see what you've done, God. And we look forward to what you have in store for us in our lives, God. And I pray that we don't ever take those kind of things for granted, that we don't ever overlook blessings, God, that we are in a continual state of prayer where we can be fellowshipping with you all the time. We need to acknowledge that you're right there all the time. And we need to take steps of faith, even if they're small, because the small ones lead to big ones, God. Just look at what you did with Daniel in the first 3 years of his exile, God. You took him from just being a servant of the king, and with a little bit of faith, God, you put him into a very predominant position where he can be used mightily by you, God. So we're excited, God. We're excited for what you have in store in this Bible study. I ask that you just continue to bless everybody here, God. Bless this church and continue to guide us and equip us, God, as we do your work here. We love you and we trust you. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.